Welcome. Today we're going to get into assembling various techniques in Adobe Illustrator to create out a visual image that we can use for any type of project. And it's just a matter of combining these different techniques that can create an interesting dynamic. A simplified variation we have in front of us is the practicing for the midterm. And through this process, it may seem a little bit more difficult because we have this intricate pattern going on in the background, but we'll break this down into the simplest format as possible so you can understand the tools that you'll need to be able to be successful and create something of your own. If I look at all the examples, yes, there are several pieces that make up this overall design. But it's important to understand that we're looking to see the process, and we can see that there are several pieces that are going to be broken down, whether it's getting into using the stylize zigzag tool to create out a shape from a circle like this, or getting into creating out a blend in which lines follow on a spine, or just simply going in using gradients and creating out what looks like a ribbon. Modifying text to stack on top of each other, or wrapping text along a path, on a curved path as well. If we're looking at these white lines, we have a combination of two paths being blended together, and we can see different weights, so it's creating a little bit nicer, intricate dynamic. And towards this top area, we have what it looks like text being blended together. Between two variations, we use the blend to create a transition, and then I can sit another copy of this text so that it is more dynamic and has more tension. But even from the basics of just simply using a rectangle to create out a background, building out the pattern, which we'll take a look at in a moment, and then either getting into cutting out pieces or drawing out a shape that can be part of our background image. All these assemble together into one idea. And we're going to look to see how we can build this out today. Start off, I'm going to go over to the rectangle tool, left side navigation. With the rectangle tool, I can click and drag, and I'm going to leave a little bit of area of white around the border. And I can change out my foreground color. If I would like to sample color, I can always go in my swatches. Or if I want to use my eyedropper tool, holding down Shift on my keyboard, I can click on the color I want. Just understand that if I do want to have this color on my stroke or fill, I have to have that specific section selected. So if I take a look at my top navigation or my left side navigation, my fill is selected. So if I wanted to sample white, you see white appear inside of this area. But if I hold down or click on my stroke, I could sample out the white here and apply it on my stroke. Because I'm holding Shift, it will sample whatever color and apply it onto that section that we have selected, whether it's the stroke or the foreground. But again, we're just going to keep it to a orange fill, and I do not need a stroke for this. But now that I have my orange background, we're going to look to draw out a pattern shape. I've given a sample of what the pattern looks like that makes up our overall design. So we have a number of different shapes here. Many different ways of using tools to build out a shape or build out a pattern itself. For me, I'm going to start with a basic shape using an ellipse tool. With the ellipse tool, I can click and drag to create out a shape. And just to make sure it's a little bit cleaner, I'm going to just make this black so I can see it. But once I have the circle, I'm going to go over my direct selection tool, the white arrow. Click and drag, click on the top point, and I can modify the shape. I'm going to go over to my anchor point tool, located in the same location as the pen tool. Clicking on the top anchor point, it sharpens out this corner. And getting a little bit closer look, I can see how I can modify individual selections with my direct selection tool. Pulling up on an anchor point, or clicking and dragging an anchor point where I want. Or I can use these handles to modify the shape of this. Just understand that we can get into making this more customized, its own unique shape. Just a matter of modifying out the handles, or modifying out the anchor points, or adjusting the handles to give more of a bend or less of a bend, depending on what you're trying to create. If at any point you want to modify individual handles, you can click on the anchor point tool again, grab from one of the anchors of the handle to modify and adjust that shape out. Just want to create a little bit more of a bend on the line, but that should work for the first initial shape. If I want to face it in a different direction, I can always rotate it or right click, transform, reflect. You can have it facing the opposite direction. Just make sure that if I want to go right, then I have the vertical. If I want to turn upside down, we have the horizontal. So we'll click OK. Now with the shape, rather than trying to draw out the shape over and over again, I'm going to use the shape. I can hold down Alt or Option on my keyboard, click and drag, and it creates out a copy. I'm just going to shrink this down to give me another variation in size. And I'll do this again one more time, Alt or Option on my keyboard, Alt for a PC, Option for Mac. And again, I can hold down Shift as I scale to create a variation or a smaller variation of the shape. If you do want to modify it, we can get into rotating, just moving your cursor on the outside of the object. And I'll rotate the bottom one a little bit off to the side, just so it has a little bit more flow, consistency, rotating outward along the shape. Next, we're going to look to draw out a stem, which many different ways we can do this, but for myself, I'm going to go with the pen tool, something I'm comfortable with. I'm going to click and drag to create out a curved line. Click on the anchor point to end the curve, and then I can click and drag to create out my own next curve. Again, just click on the anchor point. Now I'm going to go back to where I started, click and drag until I'm satisfied with the curved line. If I do want to add any additional elements, maybe I want to put in additional shapes, we can either add it in now, or when we get into creating out a pattern, we can always add in pieces if we're not satisfied with a certain area. So if I have these pieces, what I'm going to look to do is select out all of them with the selection tool, the black arrow. I'm going to click and drag over them. I can make a copy or hold down Alt or Option and click and drag. Making a copy, I can hit Command or Control C, then Command or Control V, making a new copy. But again, I want to rotate this around. I can either go to the top corner, click and drag to get a exactly 180-degree rotation. Just hold down Shift and you can rotate it in 15-degree increments, 45-degree increments. It's just a matter of what you're looking to create. So with this, I'm going to look to arrange it so they're stacking on top of each other and working as one cohesive piece. Once I have these pieces that are now a little bit better connected, I'm going to select all of them, and I'm going to go up to Object at the top navigation, down to Pattern, and Make. This will automatically recognize the shapes that you have now created. Now we can get into stacking and arranging it to see how we can make this one more cohesive piece. Right now, what I do not like is the open gaps that I have, but what we can take a look at is the tile type. Right now I currently have a grid system, but if I were to look at a brick by row or brick by column, we can arrange it in more of a scattered effect where it fits a little bit better to the overall design. What I would like to do is add a little bit of space in between these shapes that I've created. So I'm going to first look to add in a little bit of height. So I'll knock this up to 5.8 inches. And it will automatically apply onto the shape as we go into it. Now I'm going to look to reduce down the width. And it's minor adjustments. Unfortunately, you can't click and drag over type of the number to adjust, but I could always hit the up or down arrow on my keyboard to adjust the placement. So if I would like it tighter, you can just nudge it to where I'm satisfied with the shape. And again, I did mention earlier, you can always add in shapes. So if I did want to add in another feature, I could use the pen tool to draw into a certain section. And as I add this one single piece, it's actually being added onto every copy around this actual shape. So you can make this as detailed or intricate as you like. Again, if I want to add another element, we see how it's being added to the other areas as well. But this just helps to fill out the other spaces. So with these two, I can select them out. Command C, Command V. I'm going to rotate it around and look to place it in similar placements, but we want to avoid the overlap. So this is where we can tell that there are a couple of issues. I may want to adjust my placements, keep it a little bit closer to the objects so that there is no overlap on the pieces. Again, feel free to tweak the shape. If it's not flowing how you want, you can always adjust with the handles using the direct selection tool, making a more customized space and object for your design. So now taking a look at this design overall, it's a lot more cohesive, flows about a lot better together. So once I'm satisfied with this, I can either just double click outside the object or just hit back on the top left corner, exit out of the pattern exit mode. But I can just go over again to an open space, just double click, and now my pattern is created. Though my pattern isn't in front of us, if I wanted to see my pattern, what I'm going to do is go over to a shape tool. I can click and drag to create out a shape. And over in our swatches panel on the right side navigation, I can see I have new pattern 2. If I click on it, we can now have this intricate pattern that we created, making it look very intricate, but overall it's just a few shapes stacked on top of each other and modified to look as one cohesive piece. So now that I have this, I'm going to look to place this pattern over top of our orange shape. I can scale it. You see that the pattern does not move, it's just modifying out to the shape of the object that we created. If I'm looking at the original variation, we have this lighter orange. You could go into modifying out the color pattern. If I wanted to modify the pattern itself, I could double click and easily just change the color inside of the objects. So if I wanted it red, I click out, now I see what it looks like with red shapes. Or you can take a look at blend modes. So if I'm going to undo, I can hit Command or Control Z, put it back to black. And with this pattern selected, we can take a look at our transparency panel on the right side navigation. With the transparency panel, if I take a look at my options, yes, I go individually one at a time to see which one works. For myself, I know soft light's going to give me this lighter orange variation that I think subtly blends in with the rest of the design. So once we have our background on the orange, now we're going to get into creating out a curve shape. I'm going to go over to the pen tool and I'm going to change my fill color to none, clicking on the red diagonal line. And right now I have a black stroke. I'm going to change this to white. So I can just double click on the area, modify it in the color picker. With the pen tool, I'm going to look to draw out a curve shape. Click a point, click and drag, and you can modify out the shape to however you like. I'm going to just follow relatively to what I have for the mockup. But once I have this line, I'm going to hit escape to end this line for a moment. I'm going to adjust the weight of the stroke. Right now, if I adjust the weight, I'm going to move it up to about 3 point. If I want to go thicker, I can always modify it to whatever thickness I'd like. Now I have this one line. I'm going to look to draw out a second line. And this one is going to just be similar in shape, but going to be just a different placement. And we can get closer to the object or further away. It's up to you where you want to place your curve. But now that I have this curve, I can again hit escape to end the line. I'm going to look to select out both these pieces. With both these pieces selected, I'm then going to look to create a blend between the two. So if I get a little bit closer, just so we can see it better. If I want to select on one, click on one, hold down Shift, click on the other, and I can either go up to Object at the top navigation, go down to Blend, and Make, and it creates one copy inside of the object. If I wanted to modify it more, go back up to Object, back down to Blend, and this time I'm going to click on Blend Options, where right now I have Smooth Color displayed as my spacing. I'm going to change the specified steps. I'm going to type in 20. With 20, when I check and recheck preview, I can see a number of variations in between the original two. If I like to do it this way, that's absolutely fine. Another method for doing it, I'm just going to step back. With them both selected, I'm going to go over to our blend tool on the left side navigation. The blend tool looks like a transition of a square into a circle. And with your icon, that little white square, I'm going to click on each individual line. And it again just repeats the same process. So over on the left side navigation with this blend icon, rather than going up to Object Blend, I can double click on the icon and it brings up the same panel. So with Smooth Color, I'm going to switch to specified steps and again change it out to 20. And understand you can still get into customization. Right now we have these two lines, but if I wanted to modify out one individual line, we can double click on one of them with the selection tool, the black arrow. I'm going to double click on that line and then select on it once. Right now this is at 4 point. I'm going to reduce this down so it's a little bit subtle and a little bit more elegant in the blend. So I'm going to reduce this down to 0.5. Now when I click outside of this object, we have this smoother transition happening. If I feel like the other line is still too thick, I can always double click on it and then modify that thickness as well. But once we have this smooth blend happening between the lines, what I'm going to look to do is take the original line I created. So I have to go back into isolation mode and select on this line. I don't want to have the other line selected, but I'm going to hit Command or Control C, which is copy. Double click out of isolation mode. And then I'm going to hit Command or Control F. That pastes a new copy of that same exact line right on top of the location where we had our first line. Now that I have this, we're going to look to continue to use this line as part of our frame for covering up some of our pattern. So I'm going to go over to my pen tool, third tool left side navigation, click on the anchor point that makes up the end of my line, and then go up towards the top of my shape, tracing around the outside of my orange pattern, and getting back down to where I started on the opposite side. So right now I have the white on my stroke, but I'm going to swap fill the stroke, and now I have the white filling in this space. So we can see that we're starting to build and match out the design. And now we have this little transition of these blends working as one. If we wanted to ever get into cutting out certain sections of a design, I could use shapes over top of an area, or I can get into customizing out shapes of my own. So as an example, I'm going to go towards the top left corner, click a point, and draw out more curved out triangle. Just so I can see this better, I'm going to put a black frame on it with a stroke, so it's a little bit more visible. If we want to get into customizing out shapes, you may want to consider having your smart guides on so you can see those lines and make sure that everything is lining up together. clicking on the anchor point. This allows me to get curves or match to a certain shape. But make sure that we always enclose up the shape so that we can draw out anew. You can always adjust with the direct selection as well, or use the arrow keys on your keyboard to nudge it into the location that you want. And I'll just add one more shape. So the reason why I drew out these shapes, what I'm going to look to do is select on each of them. And the reason why I can click inside of them is because they have a white fill. So if I really wanted to see this on a different element, I'm going to just fill this in with a different color so you can see it. So we have green with a little black stroke. But we're not meant to keep this. This is actually going to be a cutout so that we can reveal some of the pattern over on this left corner. So with the green shape selected, I'm going to hold down Shift and make sure to select on the white background. I'm not selecting on our pattern or the orange background, but I'm going to go over to my shape builder, left side navigation, and holding down Alt or Option on my keyboard, I can click on each of these pieces to cut out a gap inside of this space. So if I were to lift it up, we see that we're getting these cutouts inside of the shape. So simple enough. Now have the background for our design. Now we can get into adding in some details and manipulating out type inside the space. Previously, we did get into creating out a copy of our line. And we're going to look to do that as well again so that we can put type on top. So I'm going to look to double click on this curved shape. And I want to make sure to get the line, not the actual white outside space. So with this line selected, I'm going to hit Command or Control C. Double click outside of isolation mode, Control V. Just so I can see it, I'm going to knock this white stroke out to black. And I can look to place it along this edge so I can look to place in some type. If I do want to place in type, I want to make sure to get the text. I provided the quote from Charles Mingus. But if we want to look to place text on a line, we're going to go over to our type tool. With our type tool, we want to move our cursor right onto the edge of this path. And we'll see that our cursor changes from this box shape to recognizing the path itself. I'm going to start my line closer towards the bottom edge, so just to make sure I get out the entire line. And when I click, it automatically fills in with Greek type or Latin text, just filling in the space. But I can hit Command or Control V, pasting in the quote that I have. And for this quote, I'm going to look to use a Montserrat regular, about a 15 point. If I do want to slightly adjust the spacing, I can look to modify on the actual path line. To modify on the path line, you want to grab from these blue lines that start at the beginning of the quote or the end of the quote. But just make sure not to accidentally click on the white box. You want to stay away from the white box. Just adjust the line as needed to where you want. Over on the top right side, you can see that I'm cutting off the name, so I am going to adjust my text size slightly. From 15.5, I'm going to just reduce this down to, say, 15.3. And make sure that you have the text highlighted when you do reduce it down. Reduce it a little bit further, still a little bit too big, so if I knock it down to 15, now I'm able to get Mingus on there, but I'll go a little bit smaller. until I am satisfied with the overall space of the text. So now we have this text wrapping along the seam around the edge where the blends are happening, but it flows together as one cohesive piece. Now we want to consider getting into how to modify text using a simple type tool. If I'm looking at the example of practicing for the midterm, if I want to make a copy of this, Command or Control C, just so I can get a reference. I'm trying to recognize and kind of create and reflect the same exact spacing. So I'm going to go over to my type tool, and I can type out the information. For myself, I know that I'm likely going to have midterm as a separate text box. It's just a little bit faster and more efficient. But even if I have a mistype, I can always adjust the space or the capitalization of my text at any time using the type of Illustrator. So right now I have practicing for the midterm. What I'm going to look to do is make this all capital letters. I go up to type at the top navigation, down to change case and uppercase. Once we have all the uppercase, I'm going to break it down so we have the 4 on the second line, and I can drop the to the next line as well. Before we do take out midterm and make it its own text box, we are going to change the font. And for example, we're going to put it onto Montserrat, and we're going to go with a bolder look overall. We want to go black. It just gives a lot more visibility, easy to recognize, easy to read. If at any point we want to modify this out, understand that we can get into modifying out our leading, tracking, or kerning, but either in our character panel on the properties panel. I currently have my layout set for the Essentials Classic. But if I want to bring up my character panel, I go up to Window, top navigation, down to Type and Character. This pulls up the character panel in which we can start modifying out our type. So if I have all my types selected, it will modify the text all together at once. You may not necessarily want to do that at all times. So if I wanted to highlight over just practicing, I can get into adjusting out the type itself, making it larger, matching it closer to what we have here. If I want to adjust any of the spacing between letters, I don't particularly like using the kerning. I think it's very limiting in how to adjust. It always brings up a panel if you have more than 2 letters selected. But what I would recommend is using the tracking, where the highlighted VA, if I hit the up or down arrow, I can get into creating more or less space in between these letters. So I can easily spread them out. But I also want to consider the leading, the space between lines. For leading, I want to modify the space, the gap in between. So I'm going to look to first select out for and the. And with for and the, I'm going to go over to my set the leading, where capital A stacked on top of another capital A with a little arrow pointing up and down. If I reduce this downward, I can cut down the space in between the lines. Right now you're not seeing the transition or get smaller because midterm is part of the same line, and I did not modify that original leading. So if I hit enter, I can kind of focus on what I need to do for this text. So for the, again, I can go over to the 61, which I had for 4 or 60, or you can get into creating out your own spacing as well. So if I want to make this text a little bit bigger, so it matches up better to 4, this way I can get the R and the E lining up together as one. Gives me a lot more control with my text. For my midterm, rather than modifying out different categories or more complicated variations, I'm just going to hit Command or Control C, backspace, and I can look to create a text box of my own. Simply hitting Command or Control V places midterm on its own separate area. So this is where I can get into scaling this up. lining text up together, it gives us the ability to fit areas of text as one. If I want to scale it down, because I didn't actually create a text box, I could extend this text, but I don't think that matches very well. So what I am going to consider doing is modifying out my for and the. But as text, we really are restricted to what we have overall. So if I want to modify for the, yes, we can get into modifying out the size of the text. And again, I will have to modify out my leading as well because it is smaller type. So it is a back and forth to figure out what works for you. But once I have that, now I can see if I can get midterm to fit a little bit better overall. It's not quite perfect, and again, just not lining up exactly where I want. So if I wanted to get better control of modifying the size of type, we can look to turn our type into outlines. With outlines, it gives us the ability to modify text how we want a little bit easier, just understanding that you can't go back to edit the text. What I'm going to look to do is select on the type, and go up to type at the top navigation, and create outlines. With outlines, I can see that it's now become objects. And for these objects, I can get into modifying the spacing or modifying out the text of each individual letter or select out different words. So if I double click into isolation mode, I can select out for and the and maybe expand this up a little bit bigger, but it's not affecting the overall design. It's allowing me to focus on individual elements. With midterm, again, this is its own separate text box, so I have to go back up to type and create outlines. But now that I have midterm as outlines, I can get into distorting this to my preference of spacing and size. So I want that midterm a little bit bigger, so that means I'm going to have to make for and the a little bit smaller. So I'm just going to scale this down. This way I can align the text to fit better to the alignment of the top and bottom letters of my midterm text. Once we get it aligned, we can look to place it and have it a little bit more centered to the rest of our design. So clicking out of it. Right now, if I try clicking on the text, it still doesn't have midterm as part of the same design. If you want to group text or group different objects together as one, I want to select on all the objects and click on one, hold down shift and click on the others, or click and drag from an open space. But with them both selected, I'm just going to hit group along my contextual taskbar, or I can go up to or hit Control G on my keyboard to group them. But now that I've grouped them, if I click on it, it selects out the whole thing. It's very easy to move. With this, we can get into really customizing out our text and creating out some blends. So I'm going to look to make a copy of this text, and we're going to change the colors just so we can see it a lot more visibly. I'm going to go over my swatches panel. Right now, I'll just make this out to red or a different color just so we can see it easier. If I hold down Alt or Option, again, I can just look to make a copy. Click and drag. I'm going to change this color out as well. Make sure you understand what layer is over top of the other. If we want to create a blend, we want to know which one is going to be appearing in the back and which one is going to be appearing in the foreground. So the orange is currently in the foreground. Again, we could always change the colors to whatever we want. And we can create a transition between these two colors to create a more interesting blend. So as we did with the blend tool earlier with the lines, I want to select on both the objects. I can either go over to my blend tool on the left side navigation, click on each individual group of text, and we see it makes a copy. Or again, you can go up to object, do the same process as well, to whatever your preference is. So I'm going to double click on this icon, change smooth color to specified steps. This time I'm going to type in 100 because I want a smooth transition between the two. When I click OK, we get this transition happening in between this text. If I take a closer look, it looks okay from afar, but closer up, we'll notice that there is some pixelation or what looks like pixelation in the top left corner along this edge. It's not seamless. So we want to add in more blends. I can also see that looking at the text, it becomes muddied and you can't really read the text overall. Because they're similar in color and because we're creating blends, they're overlapping and creating out just chunks of a gradient. So if I double click into isolation mode, I can select on this text, try a different color. Yes, they are a lot more contrasting now, but again, it's hard to read if I'm just trying to get a sense of what it says. So if I want to modify this, I'm going to first look to create out the blend. So back in my blend options, with it selected, I'm going to go specified steps. This time instead of 100, I'm going to do, say, 300. The more you have, the more smooth it's going to be. But just don't go crazy. It could end up crashing a program. Always just be cautious. So 300, I'm going to click OK. And now if I look closer towards the edge of this object, very smooth lines in comparison to what I had previously. You can also think about customization of how this text is going to be portrayed. If I want to have more of a headline or punch off the page, I can consider playing with the size of one of these boxes. So if I were to double click, selecting on this bottom one, I could scale this down, holding Shift, and this actually creates the illusion that it's punching out off the page. While I'm in isolation mode, I'm going to select on my top variation of the type. Again, we've had a lot of issues not being able to identify or see what we're trying to get across. So what you could consider doing is making a duplicate or copy of this top layer. So what I'm going to do is hit Command or Control C. And the most important step is to get out of isolation mode. Getting out of isolation mode allows me to create a copy without duplicating out the blends on another layer. But now if I hit Command or Control V, I paste in a new copy, or I can hit Command or Control F and place it directly where I want it. Switching out the foreground color to white, or the fill color to white, we can easily read it on a darker background, but if I'm placing this white text on top of a white background, it's going to get lost. So you want to be careful not to consider just doing white unless we're getting into adding a stroke or some element to make it stand out better later on. So if I take a closer look, placing this text over top, looks similar to what we have, but obviously the color can change, and we'll talk about that shortly. But I'm going to scale this up a little bit more. And again, if we want to get into customization, I take a look at the design. It's hard to see the separation of the text to the background. Sometimes this can work as a design element, sometimes it may not be the best option. So just understand that we can get into creating more interest. I'm going to add in a stroke. And this stroke is actually going to be more of the orange color that I originally had. So on the stroke, I'm going to adjust over. I can either use the swatches and click on an orange. Now I get that orange on the punch out. But you want to be careful. Make sure that your text is clearly reading. If you do have a text that creates out these shapes, you can always use the shape builder to combine them, or go over to our Pathfinder, hit Unite, and now they are individually selected on shapes. Now we're not seeing those little gaps, even though they technically are there underneath of the image. But I also don't like this blue and green, so I'm going to look to change out these colors. For the top one, I'm going to bring it over to my orange that I originally set. So if I'm double clicking out of it, now it starts to blend in with the rest of the design a lot better. Screen doesn't look great, so again, I'm going to select on this one, double click into isolation mode. I'm going to knock this out to white. We don't need to make it transparent, but knocking it out to white because we have a white background, we now can kind of see the dimension and the text jumping off the page. Any modifications you want to make, darkening up the strokes, that's absolutely up to you. So having the text with now that little bit broader orange-red stroke allows you to make it really stand out still grab your attention. Now we want to consider other elements in the design. We're going to take a look at how to get into these ribbon effects and how to get into the shape. To get into the shape, we're going to look to start out with a circle shape. I'm going to do it off to the side of the shape just so we can have some separation. Drawing out a circle, you can hold down Shift to make sure it's a perfect circle. With a circle created, I'm going to go up to Effects at the top navigation, down to Distort and Transform, and then click on Zigzag. With Zigzag, it will create out sharp corners, or I can soften up the corners hitting on Smooth rather than seeing corners. We can adjust the distance of the shape, having it more spurting out, or a little bit closer, a little bit more subtle, having this wavy line. We can also add in a number of ridges, so it can be more of a stamp or star type of shape. Just understand that if you want smooth or you want corners, it all depends on what type of design you're looking for. So once I have the shape that I like, I can click OK. With the shape, it works overall. It may not necessarily match exactly what I have, but very similar. If I place this over top, it works, but we can kind of see this blue outline of the original shape. It can be a little bit annoying not being able to modify it how you originally had. So to save us some trouble, I'm going to go up to Object and Expand Appearance. With Expand Appearance, it creates an outline around that area. So now we can get into simply modifying this how we want. With this object, we're going to look to see how we can add in this border. This border is not just adding a stroke, but we're creating a second on top, or part of the shape. So this is called a path or offset path. With the shape selected, I'm going to go up to Object, down to Path, and Offset Path. You can see it automatically creates out space. It depends on what size you want. I can use the up or down arrow to adjust the size, figure out the spacing that I want. With this, now I can hit OK. And this allows me to either choose on the outside, modify the outside, or I can modify the inside, depending on what you're trying to create. So if I wanted to add a thicker stroke on the interior, I could always adjust my stroke. Over on the right side navigation, I can have my stroke on the outside of the shape. You can see it's a little bit different. If I wanted to drop the color or change the color in any way, I can choose out a different color. Or if I want to eliminate out a stroke, just simply hit on the red diagonal line. So this gives me just a white border around the outside of my orange. It doesn't really stand out well, so I may want to consider putting a drop shadow on this. Selecting out the shape, I'm going to go up to Effects, down to Stylize, and Drop Shadow. The drop shadow, just a subtle element to make it punch off the page. You can always modify the settings to your satisfaction, but I'm going to click OK on the pop-up and click off the object for right now. Momentarily, we'll take a look at the adding in text and adding in the sunburst, but we're going to get into adding the ribbon right now. With the ribbon shape, I'm going to start out with a rectangle. With a rectangle, I can click and drag. And I'm going to look to draw out a polygon shape, or technically a triangle. If I want to modify a triangle shape, I can click and drag, creating out the shape, but I can hit the down arrow to get to a triangle shape. Give me 3 points, 3 corners. If I want to get a perfect triangle, I can hold down Shift so it aligns flat on the bottom. Just so I can see this better, I am going to add a stroke, make sure that it's visible and easy to see. I can do that with a rectangle, so I'll make that visible as well. But we're looking to fit this triangle or extend this triangle to the width of our rectangle. I'm going to lower this top middle down a little bit so we can get this little cut like we see with the original example. I'm also going to use the pen tool to draw out a line that extends from the top middle of our rectangle down to the bottom. The reason for this is that we're going to have a separation between the two. So using the shape builder, I want to select on the line, the triangle, and the rectangle. With the shape builder, I can hold down Alt or Option, cut out the bottom portion. Now we have the left and right side. The reason why we're seeing this gray area is that this line in the middle does not extend far enough. So I'm going to click on just this line individually in the middle and look to pull this anchor point so it intersects with our shape. If it extends off of it, we can easily fix it, but I'm going to select on the shape, select on the line in the middle, select on the cut rectangle, and then again use the shape builder. Click on the left, click on the right. Now there's two separate pieces. We can get into coloring out two different areas. You're going to use the direct selection to cut off that anchor point that I don't want. And I'm going to select out both pieces. And make sure that this does have a fill color. I can start out with just the green and purple that I originally had. But I'll keep it flat for now so we can modify and adjust the gradients later on. With them drawn out, I'm going to select both. And this time we're going to go over to our free transform tool. With a free transform, over on the left side navigation, it's very beneficial in either modifying out an angle or adjusting a shape or object to what your preference is. Looking on the left side navigation, we have the perspective, free perspective tool, or perspective distort. With this, I can get into scaling up an object left or right, but just be careful because the perspective is a little bit restrictive. It works out very well for what we're trying to convey. Just understand you can see how it's modifying out the bottom where I may not necessarily want that angle for my bottom of the rectangle. So if I want to undo that, I can also consider the free distort. Free distort gives you a lot more capability in adjusting a shape. I can individually pull elements up to my preference. It's not going to modify the bottom and middle anchor points, but I could always use the direct selection tool to select on these anchor points and modify shape downward. But for right now, we're just looking to create out this triangular shape. Again, your preference of using out the free distort, how you want to modify out a shape, or if I don't like this, you can always go back over and try out the perspective distort. Both work overall very well, but we're going to look to place this underneath of our top of this ribbon shape, and then move this behind so the shadow does not affect it. If I want to move this object backwards, I can hit Control or Command left bracket, moving the object up or down. Up is right bracket, left bracket is moving the object downward. If I do want to modify a gradient, right now I have a black stroke I want to eliminate. I'm going to look to modify out the gradient. I'm going to select on the green piece first. Just understand if they're grouped together, just double click. You can always select on the individual piece. For my gradient, I want to go over to my gradient tool, left side navigation, and I'm going to separate it from my swatches so I can get into modifying out the gradient. I can use colors for my swatches or different areas, but I'm going to click and drag this on. Just make sure that we again are selected on the foreground color or the fill color. So when I click and drag, we see this black to white with the green inside. But I can take samples or add in color stops along the way, so I get lighter greens. If I don't like this black, I can click and drag it downward, eliminating it from the bar. If I want more samples of green, I can just move my cursor underneath the bar and click a spot. If I want to distort this color to a different color, double click, and then I can adjust it so we get a shade or a tint based on what you're trying to create. If I want to modify the direction, we can either do it in the panel here, or I think it's a lot easier using the left side gradient. I can click and drag, transfer it to the direction that I want. The same method would apply for the purple. If I did want to sample out the green, I can get the same process appearing. But again, we are going to change this out to purple. So understand you can modify with the settings of the color settings here, or you can look to choose from options up in our swatches panel. So if I am bringing swatches in, I don't necessarily need these greens. I'm going to just pull them off, and then I can do samples in between, creating darker and lighter variations. So we go dark purple, keep our original, do another dark purple. And again, I can always draw out the gradient to my preference, fitting it to my design. So clicking off of it, if I want to select on it, again add in a drop shadow. Go to Effects, Stylized Drop Shadow. We now have it sitting behind the object, and click OK. If I did want to add in highlights, you can always, again, just simply go back in, add in a feature if you want. So once we have that ribbon shape, now we want to get into our practice award. I'm going to again go over to my type tool, click and drag to create out a text box, and I'm going to type in practice award, but I'm going to change the font to Babus New. Makes the text smaller, but we can always adjust as needed. And practice award is going to be on 2 separate lines. I am going to scale up the size of the text for award just so it aligns, and then adjust the leading so that I am creating space in between the 2 text pieces. I can knock this out to an orange color. The final step that we have for our settings is getting into adding in this sunburst, these lines that are extending around. And again, this is going to be the blend tool. With the blend tool, we're going to go over to our pen tool, left side navigation. I'm going to change out my stroke color. Back out to the orange color. And with the pen tool, I'm going to click a point, draw a vertical line. I can hit escape to end the line, and I'm going to thicken up the stroke. In my strokes, I want to consider rounding out my corners and adding in caps, so it is a rounded element on the lines. If I take a closer look, we can see with the caps, it does round it out on the top edge. Round out the corners, just in case I do have a curved line, which we won't have for this. But once we have one, we're going to look to create a copy. So I can hold down Alt. Holding down Alt, I'm going to click and drag to the side. But what we want to do is make sure that it stays perfectly aligned. So as you drag to the right, hold down Shift while holding Alt, so that it always stays perfectly aligned. Once I have these, we're going to look to select out both. Just as we created blends before, we're going to go back up to Object. This time, we're going to go down to Blend. Make. It creates a number of transitions. Remember, we had a lot of blends in our last blend. If I want to modify this, just double click on the blend tool or go up to Object Blend. I'm going to change specified steps, and I'm going to reduce this down to about 25. Before hitting OK, just check preview, make sure that you're satisfied with it. Once I'm satisfied, I can click OK. Next, we're going to draw out a circle shape. And go over to the ellipse tool, click and drag to create out of that circle. We can scale this. It doesn't necessarily need to be too large, but we are going to scale to your preference. And I'm going to look to delete out with the direct selection tool. Click on the bottom anchor point. I can hit backspace, cutting out this shape. Remember, if you do ever wanted to place text on this, the type tool, you would need to make sure that the circle is just a path, so it has to have two endpoints. You cannot add text around the outside edge of a closed object. If I click inside, it just places text inside. What I would have to do is delete out a point or delete out a section. So if it's deleting out a section, I can still add text that wraps around. Clicking on the outside edge, we see the text wrapping onto the object. But for this, we're just looking to delete out this bottom anchor point. Hit backspace. So now that we have our blend on the top, we have this curved line. We're going to look to use the blend that we have on these top lines. We're going to select out with the curve and back up to object, back down to blend. This time we're going to hit replace spine. With replace spine, it puts those lines onto this curve shape. But this isn't the setting that I want to modify. I want to have it more of a sunburst. So I'm going to go back over to my blend options. And I'm going to change my orientation from these vertical settings to the align to path. And we get this now sun cascading through the sky, each line extending outward. So I'm going to click OK. Now we want to see how we can cut off some areas that we don't want. If I do want to add in this verse, I want to think about, okay, it's not necessarily a lot of lines or lines extending long, just a matter of having these elements towards the end. So I'm going to go over to left side navigation and click on the ellipse tool again, drawing out another circle. I can click and drag. If we want to make sure that the circle and these lines are centered, right now I can tell it's off centered over on the right side. I can select out both and we can use our align panel. Our line panel, we can see at the top navigation, this gives us the best settings. If I click on the horizontal align center, it centers everything, so it's perfectly aligned in the middle. I could adjust and see what it looks like if we're adjusting on the middle settings, but you can see that it doesn't align to what we want. So that just first setting, the line center, horizontal, is giving us what we want, leaving us this outer edge. If I want to move this in any way, I can always adjust the placement, but I should be satisfied with this. Before we do get into cutting out certain elements, what we're going to look to do is turn this blend path of all these lines into an expand. So we're going to go up to object only with these outer lines selected. Go object, expand. I'm going to uncheck fill and stroke. Click OK. And now these are individual lines and no longer part of a blend. Now that we have them individually, we're going to select out over everything, selecting out the circle that we have. I'm going to click over on the shape builder. Be careful when getting into cutting out the interior of this. We're not just simply clicking and dragging through. That's not how it's going to work for this process. What we have to do is hold down Alt or Option, and if I move my cursor carefully over top of one of those lines, you see that it turns to red. This means that we're going to cut out the line without affecting the others. Unfortunately, it is a little bit tedious, and you have to take your time just to make sure you get every one. We're going to do this for every individual line inside of the circle. If I mess up, just hit Command or Control Z. But again, Alt or Option. Make sure you see the red line appear. This one wasn't showing up for a second, so just want to make sure. But each time you see that red line, just click on it. Now that I've cut out the interior, you no longer need this outer circle. So I'm going to select on the circle, just hit backspace. Now we have these lines on the outside. There's still one group, and we're going to look to place this up on the top side of our practice award. And look to scale it down. And look to place it where needed. So we just get it flaring around the outer edge. Fits very well overall. If I click outside of the object, you can always thicken up the strokes as needed. But we've now replicated and created out a very similar design to the original. I hope this is beneficial, and have a great time experimenting with all the different tools.